Immaculate knelt in the corner of her room, her Bible clutched tightly in her hands. She had grown accustomed to the heavy silence of the mansion, broken only by the whispers of servants gossiping about her. Since her decision to dedicate her life to God, her once loving parents, Mr. and Mrs. Adewale, had turned into strangers. They viewed her newfound faith as rebellion, a disgrace to their high societal standing in Lagos. That morning, Immaculate was summoned to the dining room. Her father's face was stern, his jaw set in a way that made her stomach tighten. Her mother sat beside him, her manicured fingers drumming against the glass table. "We've tolerated your nonsense long enough," Mr. Adewale began, his voice cold. "This religion of yours ends today." Immaculate looked up, her eyes filled with resolve. "Daddy, I can't turn my back on God. I love you both, but my faith is who I am." Her words seemed to ignite something in him. Without warning, he slammed his fist against the table, making the plates rattle. "You will not embarrass this family," he roared. Mrs. Adewale sneered, her voice dripping with disdain. "You're nothing but an ungrateful child. After all we've done for you, this is how you repay us." Tears burned Immaculate's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She stood firm, though her heart ached at the venom in her parents' words. She barely recognized them anymore. Later that evening, the consequences of her decision became painfully clear. Her father ordered the maids to strip her room of everything except her bed. Her textbooks, clothes, and even her phone were locked away. Immaculate was left with nothing but her faith. When night fell, she prayed fervently, tears streaming down her face. She asked God to give her strength and to touch the hearts of her parents. Deep inside, she believed that no matter how much they despised her now, love would win in the end. But as the days turned into weeks, their actions grew harsher, and Immaculate's resolve was tested like never before. The morning air was heavy with tension. Immaculate woke up to find her door locked from the outside. Panic set in, but she quickly reminded herself to trust God. She knelt beside her bed and prayed, her voice soft but steady. Her prayers were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, revealing one of the maids, Grace, who slipped inside with a plate of food. "Madam said you're not allowed to leave this room," Grace whispered, her eyes filled with pity. "Thank you," Immaculate said, offering a faint smile despite her predicament. Later that day, her father barged into the room, holding a stack of papers. "These are applications for prestigious universities abroad," he said. "Choose one, or you'll never leave this house again." Immaculate looked at the papers and shook her head. "Daddy, I can't trade my faith for freedom." Mr. Adewale's face turned red with fury. "You're determined to ruin your life, aren't you?" he spat before storming out. As the weeks passed, the isolation weighed heavily on Immaculate, but she found solace in her Bible and constant prayer. Meanwhile, her parents plotted ways to break her spirit. They spread rumors about her to their social circle, claiming she had joined a cult. Friends and relatives stopped calling, and Immaculate felt more alone than ever. One night, she overheard her parents arguing. "This has gone too far, Adewale," her mother said, her voice trembling. "She's still our daughter." "She's a disgrace," her father retorted. "We need to teach her a lesson." Immaculate's heart sank. The people who were supposed to protect and love her had become her greatest adversaries. But she clung to her faith, believing that God was with her even in the darkest moments. Despite their cruelty, Immaculate's resilience began to stir something in her parents. They noticed her unwavering kindness, her refusal to retaliate, and her steadfast faith. It unsettled them in ways they couldn't explain. One day, while Immaculate was praying in her room, her mother quietly opened the door. For the first time in months, there was no disdain in her eyes, only confusion. "Why do you still pray?" she asked. "After everything we've done to you, why do you still believe?" Immaculate looked up, her eyes filled with compassion. "Because God loves me, and He loves you too, Mommy. I pray for you and Daddy every day." Mrs. Adewale stood there, stunned. She left without saying a word, but something in her heart began to shift. As the days turned into weeks, Immaculate continued to face challenges, but the seed of change had been planted in her parents' hearts. Weeks passed, and the tension in the house remained thick, but something was changing. Immaculate's steadfast kindness and her refusal to harbor bitterness began to unsettle her parents deeply. They couldn't understand why she didn't lash out or crumble under their hostility. Her strength began to gnaw at their conscience. One evening, as the family sat for dinner, Mrs. Adewale cleared her throat. "Immaculate," she began cautiously, "your father and I, we've been talking. We've decided to release your things back to you." Immaculate's heart leapt with hope, but she remained calm. "Thank you, Mommy," she said, her voice soft and sincere. Mr. Adewale looked less convinced, his expression hard. "Don't mistake this for approval of your choices," he grumbled. "This is us being reasonable." Later that night, as Immaculate unpacked her belongings, she knelt in prayer, thanking God for the small breakthrough. She prayed for wisdom to handle her parents with love and patience. But the breakthrough was short-lived. The next morning, Mr. Adewale stormed into her room with a newspaper in hand. "Look at this," he shouted, throwing it onto her bed. The headline read, "Wealthy Family's Daughter Joins Radical Sect." "Do you see what your choices are doing to our reputation?" he fumed. "People are laughing at us, Immaculate." Immaculate picked up the newspaper and read the article calmly. "Daddy," she said, looking up at him, "what matters is not what people think of us but what God thinks of us." Her father's face twisted in anger. "You think you're so righteous, don't you? Let's see how righteous you are when you're out on the streets." He turned on his heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. That evening, Immaculate found her bags packed and placed by the front door. Her father stood there, his arms crossed. "You leave this house tonight," he said coldly. "Let's see if your faith can feed you." Mrs. Adewale stood in the corner, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Adewale, this is too much," she whispered, but her husband silenced her with a glare. Immaculate looked at her parents, her heart breaking, but she refused to let fear consume her. "If this is what it takes to serve God, then I'll go," she said quietly. She picked up her bags, walked out the door, and into the cold night. Immaculate spent the first night in a small church at the edge of town. The pastor, a kind elderly man named Reverend Timothy, welcomed her with open arms. "The path of righteousness is not always easy," he said, offering her a place to stay in the church's guest quarters. Over the next few weeks, Immaculate threw herself into helping at the church. She cleaned, cooked, and taught Sunday school. The congregation admired her dedication and began to rally around her. Word of her story spread, and people began praying for her parents. Meanwhile, back at the Adewale mansion, things weren't the same. The once lively home felt cold and empty. Mrs. Adewale would often stand by Immaculate's room, staring at the closed door and wiping away tears. Mr. Adewale, despite his hardened exterior, found himself pacing the halls at night, plagued by guilt and memories of his daughter's unwavering faith. One evening, while reviewing financial reports in his study, Mr. Adewale found himself distracted by a verse he had overheard Immaculate reciting once: "Train up a child in the way they should go, and when they are old, they will not depart from it." The words echoed in his mind, stirring something deep within him. The final straw came when an old friend, Chief Okonkwo, visited the Adewale mansion. "You've been blessed with a rare jewel in that girl," he said over tea. "I hear she's become a light in the community. You should be proud, not ashamed." For the first time, Mr. Adewale felt the weight of his actions. He couldn't deny the truth anymore. That night, he and his wife sat in the living room, their pride finally giving way to remorse. "We were wrong," Mrs. Adewale whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We let our pride destroy our relationship with our daughter." Mr. Adewale nodded slowly. "It's time to make things right," he said. The following morning, Mr. and Mrs. Adewale arrived at the church where Immaculate had been staying. The sight of their luxury car pulling up outside caused a stir among the congregants. Reverend Timothy stepped out to greet them, sensing the gravity of the moment. "We're here to see our daughter," Mr. Adewale said, his voice subdued. Reverend Timothy nodded and led them inside. Immaculate was in the main hall, kneeling as she taught a group of children a Bible verse. When she turned and saw her parents, her heart raced. She hadn't expected to see them, and the pain of their rejection still lingered. Immaculate, her mother said, stepping forward. Tears glistened in her eyes. We came to ask for your forgiveness. Immaculate stood, unsure if she was dreaming. Mommy. Daddy, she whispered, her voice trembling. Her father, the man who had once been so harsh and unyielding, now looked fragile. We were wrong, he said, his voice breaking. We let our pride blind us to what truly matters. You were right to stand by your faith. Please, forgive us. Tears streamed down Immaculate's face as she walked toward them. I've already forgiven you, she said, her voice filled with emotion. She hugged her parents tightly, and for the first time in months, she felt the warmth of their love. The congregation watched in silence, many moved to tears. Reverend Timothy stepped forward and placed a hand on Mr. Adewole's shoulder. This is the power of grace, he said. It heals wounds and brings families back together. The Adewole family stayed for the Sunday service that day. For Mr. and Mrs. Adewole, it was a humbling and transformative experience. As the choir sang hymns, the words seemed to pierce their hearts. They realized how much their daughter's faith had taught them about love, humility, and forgiveness. In the weeks that followed, the Adewole mansion transformed. The tension that once filled the air was replaced with peace. Mr. Adewole began attending church with Immaculate, and Mrs. Adewole joined the Women's Fellowship. They even hosted a prayer meeting at their home, inviting friends and neighbors who had once mocked Immaculate's faith. Immaculate's relationship with her parents grew stronger with each passing day. They began to see the world through her eyes, learning the importance of compassion, humility, and purpose. For the first time, their wealth and status seemed insignificant compared to the joy of having their family whole again. But not everyone was happy about the change. Some of Mr. Adewole's business associates mocked him for his newfound faith. You've gone soft, one said. This religion is bad for business. Mr. Adewole, however, remained steadfast. I'd rather have a clean conscience and a united family than all the wealth in the world, he replied, his tone resolute. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Mr. Adewole raised his glass. To Immaculate, he said, his voice full of pride. Your faith showed us the way. Thank you for never giving up on us. Immaculate smiled, her heart full. To God be the glory, she said softly. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. The family was stronger, their bond unbreakable. They had learned that true wealth wasn't measured in material possessions but in love, forgiveness, and faith.